And we're back. This is the Catholic Lady, and we're reading Great Lion of God by Taylor Caldwell, Chapter 11, Part 2. Father and son lay in the gilded litter as it wound its way through the streets, glaring with red torchlight and lamps, and through throngs of hurrying people and soldiers and mounted cavalry and camels and asses. Saul said, "It is wicked to denounce those of your blood according to the Scriptures, but Shabuah ben Abraham is an evil man." Hillel said, "No, he is not evil. There are occasions when the evil can be touched. Shabuah is a frightened man, and none can appeal to a man of fear. He is distracted, he is beyond reason. I saw fright in his eyes. I spoke to him harshly, yet I pitied him. God may forgive the evil if they repent, but how can even angels make their voices known to a man filled with panic?" But Saul said, "He is an evil man." Hillel sighed. "I wish he were only that. I can forgive all but cowardice and expediency," said Saul. "Are they not at the last the same?" The house of Joseph of Arimathea was on a wide and level street below the Mount of Olives. Behind the wrought iron gates, the house stood in tranquillity and calm. The portico filled with lamps, the gardens aromatic, heavy with pine and palm, and the spires of the dark cypresses. The gatekeeper opened the gates, and the litter entered the red gravel path to the bronze doors. The doors opened, and Joseph of Arimathea stood on the threshold. Then he stepped into the portico with its white and shining columns to welcome his guests. He was a tall and massive man, in his long blue tunic belted with gold, his arms bare. He was in his middle years and beardless, and he was nearly bald. His head was large and heavy and oval, larger than the head of an average man. The first impression of strangers was that he was ugly and without comeliness. His features were too big, his mouth too ponderous, his chin corpulent, his fat ears protruding from his skull, which was polished like stone. But his eyes were dark and radiant, mystical and kind, under black brows which met totally over the bridge of his aquiline nose. He said in a very sonorous voice which aroused echoes in the gardens, "Greetings to Hillel ben Baruch and his son Saul. Welcome to this house, which knows your illustrious name." He extended enormous and muscular hands to Hillel, then embraced and kissed his cheek. He smiled at Saul, and his smile made his face beautiful. "Shalom," he said. Hillel struggled to control himself in the face of this tender and gracious greeting, returned the embrace of his host. Joseph led them into a wide and illuminated atrium, where the overseer stood at attention, and then into another room, tastefully furnished and permeated with the scent of fresh fern. Joseph clapped his hands, and servants entered laden with linen and plates and cutlery. "I have dined," said Hillel, "though my son has not." "Come," said Joseph with another of his luminous smiles. "When can a man not enjoy food?" He studied the young Saul, and then a curious glimmer touched his eyes. For some unknown reason, Saul was disturbed at that frank gaze with its overtone of mystery. Saul did not love luxury, and this house was at least as luxurious as his grandfather's. But it seemed to him that the luxury here was not so studied, not so pervasive. He sat in silence near his father, while the servants prepared the table. Hillel said, "You know why I have come, Joseph of Arimathea?" "Yes," said his host. "I received a letter from my dear friend Aulus Platonius, who is your kinsman. But you are weary. Let us first refresh ourselves." "How is it possible when I am so distraught?" Joseph said, "All things are possible with God, and he is not without mercy, blessed be his name." Hillel's eyes filled again with tears, and he said in a broken voice, "Forgive me, but my heart is afflicted, and I am not usually so womanish." Joseph said in a gentle voice, "There are a just man's tears. When are a just man's tears womanish? If we did not weep on occasion, our hearts would be only as dead earth. And do we not have reason to grieve? Enough. Let us dine in peace, trustful in the promise of hope. What hope, thought Saul with renewed bitterness, what hope is there for man? He slowly became aware of the peacefulness about him in this house. Even Hillel, in his terrible distress, was soothed and partook of some wine, cold meats and vegetables and oil and vinegar, fruits and pastries. Saul, hot of heart and afflicted of mind, could not be insensible to the quietude of this house, the harmoniousness, repose, the placid beauty. He thought to himself that Joseph's house reflected his taste, that everything in it about him was an extension of himself. But Shabuah ben Abraham's house did not reflect him, for there was no substance in him to reflect. His house was the creation of others' tastes and others' values. He himself could create nothing. The very soft light on the white walls of this room appeared to be an emanation of Joseph of Arimathea's own spirit. Saul felt certitude, not the certitude that comes from faith in men, but in faith beyond men. And his young cramped soul shook its crumbled leaves and reluctantly began to expand. But he remained suspicious, wary of platitudes. Joseph's voice did not break the silence. It rode upon it easily. He said at last, I have seen Pontius Pilate, who owes me much, and I have seen Herod, who owes me more. I knew of the tragedy at the Damascus gate almost as it happened. For shall one of my people suffer without my knowing or caring? Alas, it was a sorrowful tragedy, and I grieve for both Roman and Jew, and for all who clash arms anywhere in a conflict which is never resolved. For so long as men exist, there will be war and hatred and oppression and rebellion, until... He paused, and he gazed into space, as if seeing some heroic vision yet unfulfilled. He resumed, It is better to die in a just cause, which may never succeed, or to live and work in hope of its final success. This has always been the enigma which has faced man, especially in his youth. The Greeks say it more brutally. It is better to die on your feet as a man than live on your knees as a slave. But merely to die, however nobly, is to remove a warrior. We cannot spare warriors. He gave Hillel his gentle smile again, but this time it was a little cryptic. Hillel was regarding him with painful attention. Let me comfort you in a small way, said Joseph, in a compassionate tone. There have been killings today, and Romans do not look upon killings of their soldiers with equanimity, nor do we regard the killing of Jews with uninterest. The Romans call themselves the men of law and reason. They could understand the anger of the Jews, for they would feel as we do if Rome were occupied by alien power and its laws enforced on her. Romans are also pragmatists. When it concerns other men's patriotism and spirit, who is stronger, Rome? Who, therefore, has the major right to rule, engage in trade, regulate commerce, build, change? Rome. This is not a virtue. It is not hypocrisy. The Romans are honestly convinced that they are the civilizing and welding force in the world, and they have always dreamed of a world government, which they believe they have brought about under the Pax Romana. Competing nations, rival empires, appear disorderly to the Romans, trivial, duplicating, self-indulgent, extravagant, expensive, without efficiency, and dangerous. If the Roman spirit could be described in one word, it would be economy. Economy in thought, deed, philosophy, action. Forgive me if I seem to be astray and tardy. I wished you to understand that I comprehend the Roman, and comprehension is half the battle when engaging in controversy. For who can hate the man he understands? He can only approach the adversary or the friend, and it is strange how often they are the same, with kindness and reason, and even with sympathy. This is not subtle wiliness. It comes from the heart, and it is genuine. Therefore, though I know Pilate well, and I know him for cruel and superstitious and ambitious man, I also know him as a man, of my human flesh and my human spirit, and I know he is not happier than I, nor more content, not alien to my being. He shares with me all the afflictions and all the hopes and avarice of mankind, and he knows that I know this of him. As for Herod, he is a man to be pitied, the man who cannot reconcile his Jewish nature with his Greek instincts. To them both today I brought my understanding and my importunities. He peeled a large ripe plum for Hillel and put it on a small golden plate. And he did not wait for the servant to serve Hillel more wine. He poured it himself. Saul watched him and thought with disgust, he is but another player on words, another deft pleader for the Roman, another compromiser, another agile man who can release himself from a trap. Such men have sold their souls for comfort, for riches, for security, and do not know the sorry bargain. As if he had heard the young man's thoughts, Joseph rested his bright, dark eyes on him for a moment, and a shadow of sadness touched them. Hillel had listened acutely and had not felt dismay nor repulsion. It was as if a strong, cool hand had been laid on a feverish cheek, and so he waited, and a faint calm came to him. Joseph said, I have persuaded Pilate to release those seized in the city as potential malcontents, who have opposed the Roman obdurately but not with violence. They have been returned to their homes with stern warnings. But they are now in the bosoms of their family. Shall the lamb be sacrificed with the lion? I asked Pilate. Joseph smiled. He also owes me considerable money, for he is a reckless gambler, and Tiberius Caesar, that harsh and rigid man, does not like gamblers. He has also compromised himself in company with Herod, with Agrippa in Rome. Fortunately, I have friends whom Tiberius trusts, and so Pilate is not to be recalled. Joseph paused. He looked at the wine in his goblet. He has a role to play, and I have seen it in my visions. I am a visionary man. Hillel's face had become tremulous with hope. Joseph lifted his hand. I did not use my money nor my influence in Rome to sway Pilate, for that would be more degrading to me than to him. I used Roman reason on him, and the Romans do not like disarray or emotionalism, nor do I. The emotional man is a man who has lost control of himself. Therefore, how can he rule others or give a judicious opinion? That I said to Pilate, and he knew I spoke in truth. That I said to Pilate, and he knew I spoke in truth. Emotion should have no part of justice, I assured him. Was it just to punish the innocent for the fault of others? Only the Greeks believed that, I told him, and he nodded his head. Only the Greeks believed that, I told him, and he nodded his head. Again Joseph smiled. The Romans, in their hearts, believe themselves inferior to the Greeks. They always welcome one who assures them of their superiority. He is a wily hypocrite, thought Saul, with increasing rage. But Hillel said, Thanks be to God, Joseph of Arimathea, that you have saved the innocent. But what of those 100 or more of the Zealots and Essenes who await a monstrous death in the prisons of the Romans? Joseph said with sadness, They I cannot save, nor do I believe that they desire to be saved. They are rash and dedicated young men, and it is the young who believe in heroic causes and court death as older men court mistresses. They believe they set a standard for others to follow, that they carry a banner which will strike fire in the hearts of other men. It is beautiful, but not very sensible. So they will die, said Hillel. Not without glory in their souls, not without exaltation, said Joseph. He poured fresh wine. To that they have always aspired. I do not deny their love, their patriotism, their devotion to God. But on the altar of these, they are more than willing to be sacrificed. Saul could not restrain himself. I too am willing, he cried. Hillel, even in his agony of spirit, wished to rebuke his son, But Joseph again lifted his hand and said, "And so you are my child, and so it will be." Dread filled Hillel's heart, for he was a father. He had heard that Joseph had a mysterious gifts of prophecy and penetration. "I would rather my son lived for his people," he said. "And so he shall," said Joseph, with his kind smile. This seemed enigmatic to Hillel. Saul's eyes were like polished metal, reflecting his deep passions and anger. Joseph went on, "I know when I have a possibility of succeeding, even a faint one, which I will press. I know when I cannot succeed, when it is useless to try. So the children of the desert must die. Pilate said to me, 'Do you Jews not have a law saying an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, and a life for a life?' I knew he was adamant on the subject of the deaths of his soldiers and officers. Who can blame him? I was grateful enough that he spared the innocent, though we know they are as inflamed as those men, if more discreet. They are also more pious. They await the Messiah and his deliverance of all men from their sins and their sufferings. Blessed be his name." Hillel's face again became tremulous, but before he could speak, Saul said, "And you pleaded with Herod, Joseph of Arimathea?" "I did. I have persuaded him to give a painless poison to those of the young heroes who showed even the slightest fear of death and suffering. A man should go to his self-evoked death with pride and rejoicing, and even with gratitude. Those of feebler and gentler spirit should be preserved from the agonies of inexorable execution." Hillel dropped his head and clasped his hands on his knee. Joseph looked at him with compassion. "Hillel ben Baruch, death is not the supreme terror, nor the most monstrous of calamities, nor is life greatly to be desired by wise men. We know this as Jews, and it was Aristotle who said, 'There are circumstances and occasions when the reasonable man will prefer to die and not to live.' You suffer for our young countrymen, for you are a Jew, and I suffer with you. But man's life at its best is brief and full of trouble and pain and despair, and there is not a man alive today who will not be dead in less than 100 years. A century from now, and few among us will be remembered, no matter if they were evil or just, saints or demons, traitors or patriots." He paused. "Only one will be remembered, blessed be his name." But Saul said in youthful agitation, which overcame his taught respect for those older than himself, "You believe that no cause is worth fighting for, no banner worth following, and that man should be complacent before evil?" "I did not say that," said Joseph. "I wish to imply that a giant is not overcome by a flea, and however determined and devoted the flea, he cannot slay the giant." "Goliath was killed by a stone flung by David," said Saul. He was almost panting in his defiance and his scorn. Joseph meditated for a moment. He said, "God has his reasons, and we know them not. We can only look knowingly on events when they have become past history. It is my belief that God now has a different role for Israel, a spiritual conquest of men, a conquest of love and joy and salvation, and not a conquest by death and blood. Except," he stopped again, and Hillel looked up from his brooding misery. "What is it that you wish to say, dear friend?" he said. Joseph hesitated. "I have had visions," he replied. "I may not speak of them, for the time has not yet come." "You believe that the coming of the Messiah is at hand?" cried Hillel. Joseph took a pomegranate in his hand and studied its scarlet surface. "What if he has come already?" he asked in a distant tone, as if proffering a theory. "He has not come," said young Saul, more scornful than ever. "If he had come, the whole world would now be proclaiming his blessed name and rejoicing, and the Roman would lie in the depths of the sea as did the Egyptians." "You believe, Saul ben Hillel, that God hates the Roman, who is his child also, and he will send the Messiah only to the Jews?" A light unto the Gentiles, it has been prophesied. A sternness appeared on Joseph's face, a rebuke. Hillel's sad eyes had become ardent as they fixed themselves on Joseph. He whispered, "You believe he has come?" But Joseph was silent. Hillel's heart began to beat with strong urgency. "I have heard of the star over Bethlehem, and I have heard that you went to the city of David." But Joseph did not speak. Saul laughed at himself. These old men loved mysteries. They loved to appear elusive and wise. He looked at his father Hillel with the light on his drawn features, and was ashamed for him that he could lend himself to this folly, this blasphemy against God. Who would send his Messiah with legions of angels, with golden trumpets, which would shatter the highest battlements, and with a glory that would daze the earth, and not obscurely, not in the night, not with equivocation? "I have prayed that I would see his salvation," said Hillel, humbly. Joseph gazed at him with a strange long look. "So shall all the just," he said. He sighed, "Ask me not of the star, or what I saw in Bethlehem, for the hour has not yet come." He directed his gaze upon Saul, and though it was intent, it was also far, as if seeing what others could not see. Saul was suddenly and dreadfully struck with the thought that such a gaze had been directed on him by the poor peasant in the marketplace. He was filled with a chill fear. Joseph conducted his guests through the atrium and the portico, and he kept his arm over Hillel's shoulders in a tender embrace. At the door he kissed Hillel on the cheek in comfort and said, "Do not grieve. All is in God's hands, blessed be his name." "I do not know why, but I am comforted," said Hillel, and he smiled through fresh tears. He hardly heard Saul's infuriated denunciations of Joseph as they sat in the litter. Later, as he prayed in his cubiculum, he heard the return of Shabuah ben Abraham, and a loud commotion, and men's disordered voices. He rose and drew his bedrobe about him, and opened the door, and peered out beyond the hall into the atrium. It was lighted brilliantly. Shabuah was there, struggling in the arms of his servants, who were apparently attempting to restrain him, and he was uttering the most incredulous blasphemies, oaths, and rages. Hillel's first impulse was to go to him. Shabuah's toga was covered with the stains of wine and meats and fruits. His hair was disheveled, and his face pale and sweating and distorted. "He is drunk," thought Hillel, and remembered that one is not to disgrace another by observing his drunkenness, and he prepared to shut his door. But there had been something in Shabuah's manner and voice and struggles which was not solely of drunkenness, though he had drunk mightily that night in contradiction with his usual restraint. Hillel paused, watching through his half-shut door as Shabuah fought with the servants and cursed them. Then, to Hillel's bewildered pity, Shabuah burst into tears and collapsed in his servants' arms, and they bore him away, and one remained behind to blow out the lamps. Hillel closed his door and pondered on what he had seen. He was filled with sadness. What had caused Shabuah's unusual orgy of emotion and chaotic derangement could not be known to him, Hillel, but he remembered that Joseph of Arimathea had spoken of the oneness of men in spite of their apparent differences. "May God have mercy on us," prayed Hillel ben Baruch, and went to his bed. "May God have mercy on all men, for we are afflicted." "May God avenge us," prayed Saul ben Hillel, and he wept in his rage and sorrow and hatred. And then he found, to his horror, that he could not resume his prayers. There was a deep numbness within him, like an awful silence, like an awful absence. And that is the end of chapter 11. Thank you for listening. And please continue with chapter 12.